Good evening, my little pips. I hope you had a nice day and are doing well. Thank you so much for all your nice comments. I was super happy when I read them. Today we are going to ancient Greece, getting to know about a few not so much heroes and gods that are following the coomer. Let's get comfy and have a good time, okay? Many cultures have myths, but not all mythologies have equal resonance. None has had greater influence than that of the classical world, which has played a huge role in the Western imagination, inspiring writers and artists to the present day. The classical myths owe their enduring appeal to their epic scope and poetic truth. Yet, they did not come out of nowhere. Throughout the long history of classical Greece and Imperial Rome, foreign influences played a part in shaping the tales. Some gods, like Dionysus, were imported from abroad. The story of Iphigenia's escape from the Crimea, bearing the cult statue of the goddess Artemis, may hint at another such transfer. At other times, foreign cults like that of Isis won adherents in the classical world, and even the tale of Io's transformation into a heifer and subsequent flight to the banks of the Nile may reflect stories of the Egyptian cow goddess Hathor. Whatever borrowings there may have been, though, the corpus of classical myths eventually outstripped all its neighbors in the breadth of its span and its sheer narrative inventiveness. The stories embrace tales of gods as their Middle Eastern counterparts did, but also legends of heroes, human epitomes of courage, strength, and resourcefulness played a greater part in them than in any previous canon. Hero myths were by no means exclusive to Greece and Rome. They had obvious Middle Eastern predecessors. Nevertheless, they formed a distinctive feature of the classical corpus, mostly conforming to a set pattern that gave the hero a prodigy-filled childhood, an adult quest or time of trial, and a tragic end. They spanned the gap between the human and superhuman worlds. Sometimes the story set out to point an obvious moral, that overboard ambition could lead to a fall, as quite literally happened in the tale of Helios and Phaeton, or, as repeated myths made clear, that humans failed at their peril to show fitting respect to the gods. Others had an expository role, seeking to explain natural phenomena, like the dangers of the narrow straits of Messina, or even man-made marvels, like the massive walls of the cities of Mycenaean antiquity, credited to a past race of one-eyed giants. A lasting strength of classical mythology, however, is its lack of predictability and its constant ability to surprise. Its gods may have been superhuman embodiments of human virtues such as power, beauty, and wisdom, but they also had the weakness of mortals. Human heroes too were sometimes shown with feet of clay. For the enduring appeal of the classical canon turns above all on the psychological realism of the stories, and their success in addressing grave themes that have lost none of their relevance with the passage of time. No myth has dealt more movingly with the pain of bereavement than the tale of Orpheus and Eurydice. Antigone's defiance of her uncle King Creon and the matter of the burial of her brother remains a classical statement of the clash between natural justice and state authority. Narratives such as these retain their power to move people to this day, bearing witness to the continuing vitality of the culture that gave them birth. Greece mythology always had a sweet spot in my heart. The tales feel so timeless, like written in the text. All the different adventures from heroes, the fantastic beasts, and the drama between the gods. One of the biggest drama makers must have been Zeus, because he's a lusty coomer and got caught in several entanglements. Our first story will be about one of these entanglements, called Europa and the Bull. Zeus was famous for his sexual adventures, and many of the stories of classical mythology start with his seduction of a mortal woman. For example, The city of Thebes was said to have been founded as a result of Zeus' desire for Europa, daughter of the king of Phoenicia. One day, Princess Europa went with her friends to gather flowers in the meadow beside the ocean. The group of laughing girls in the hot sunshine was a charming sight, and most delightful of all was Europa herself. She was so appealing that Zeus could not resist her, but knowing everything, he was aware that she was as pure as she was beautiful, and that he would be able to seduce her only through subterfuge. In the meadows where the girls played, a herd of handsome cows was grazing peacefully. One of the girls noticed a new bull in the herd, a more beautiful, stronger, and larger specimen than any they had ever seen. The princess went up to the animal, and, despite its strength and size, it turned out to be gentle and playful. Hardly had Europa set it on the bull's shoulders, then it charged into the ocean. The princess was out of her depth, and all she could do was cling on tightly. Only when they came ashore on the island of Crete did Zeus reveal to her his true identity. Europa was unable to resist him, and eventually bore him 3 sons, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Sarpedon. Back in Phoenicia, her family continued to mourn their loss. Finally, Europa's brother Cadmus, feeling compelled to take action, set out and wandered over all the world, seeking his lovely sister. But he never discovered where Zeus had hidden her. Unable to return home and face his father's profound grief, he built a new city in Greece, Thebes. Would you fall for a god? Especially for one that is not faithful at all? I hope not, because you're not a coomer, right? The only one you're going to fall for is me. I'm just kidding. I'm surprised though, how Europa didn't even thought about her family anymore. I also feel really bad for her brother, that failed to find her, and instead just built a city. That's a very nice coping mechanism, I guess. As I already teased though, poor Europa wasn't the only woman that Zeus toyed with. But this time, his jealous wife finds out about this affair. The Wanderings of Io. Like many beautiful mortals, Io, a priestess of Hera, had been seduced by Zeus, Hera's husband and the king of the gods. Hera herself came upon the couple one day as they dallied in a meadow. Zeus turned his lover into a heifer, hoping that the harmless-looking beast would escape his wife's jealous attention. But Hera at once suspected trickery, and insisted on taking the animal for herself. She led it to her courtside in the Peloponnese Peninsula, where she entrusted it for safekeeping to her monstrous servant, the 100-eyed Argus Panoptes, who was said never to close all his eyes at once. To recover his mistress, Zeus turned for help to Hermes, messenger of the gods and also an accomplished musician. Disguising himself as a goatherd, he approached Argus, playing such sweet music on his flute that the giant dozed off. As his last eye closed, Hermes saw his chance. Snatching up a boulder, he killed him with a single blow to the head. As a memorial to her watchman, Hera later placed Argus' eyes in the peacock's tail. Meanwhile, Hera had witnessed Hermes' act of violence. Furious, she sent a gadfly to torment the cow, which ran off in a wild flight to escape the insect's stings. Having first swum the Bosphorus, which took its name, meaning ox passage, from the feet, the beast eventually reached the sea that was later known as the Ionian. Leaping in, it swam all the way to Egypt. Io's luck changed when she reached Egypt. She was restored to human shape by Zeus, and in due course bore him a son, Epaphus, and a daughter Keroressa. After the god's interest in her had waned, she subsequently married an Egyptian king. In later times, mythographers would suggest that her story might originally have been inspired by second-hand accounts of Hathor, the ancient Egyptians' horned cow goddess. I hate the word heifer. I swear I have to always Google translate it over and over again to say it correctly. Oh man, anyways. So many humans knew about Zeus' affairs, right? And about Hera's wrath and jealousy. So why did so many gods still fall for him, even though they knew they were just one of many, and even might get cursed by Hera? Or didn't they know? Maybe they didn't, who knows? Is there even a story about the girl that didn't want Zeus in her pants? Maybe it's worth to make an extra video about that. What do you think? Not only Zeus though was an unfaithful coomer, but also his brother Poseidon, which our next story will be about. Scylla and Charybdis. The channel between Italy and Sicily is dangerous for sailors. With unexpected whirlpools and currents, these natural phenomena inspire tales of Scylla and Charybdis, terrors of the Straits of Messina. Scylla was a beautiful nymph to whom Poseidon, god of the oceans, became irresistibly drawn, at which Amphitrite, his wife, was seized by jealousy. To punish her rival, she secretly poured the juice of some poisonous herbs into the waters of the fountain where Scylla often bathed. As soon as the nymph stepped into the pool, she was transformed into a monster with 12 feet and 6 heads, each one with a mouth containing 3 rows of teeth. The lower part of her body was turned into a pack of dogs who barked incessantly. Terrified and appalled by her new form, Scylla hurled herself from the cliffs at the southern tip of Italy. But even this did not end her suffering. The gods confined her to a cave in the cliffs, from which she snapped at any vessels that came near her, snatching men from the decks. Sailors were unable to avoid Scylla by steering a course further out to sea, because there was Charybdis. Once a woman, now a vicious whirlpool, lay in wait. She was the daughter of Poseidon and Gaia, but despite the noble heritage, she was greedy and tried to steal Heracles' precious oxen. Heracles complained to Zeus, his father, who struck her with a thunderbolt. She fell into the sea and continued life as a whirlpool, which 3 times a day sucked down vast quantities of seawater and 3 times a day spewed it out again. Her greedy maw could pull whole ships down into the depths. And so caught between Scylla and Charybdis became a saying used to describe anyone trapped between 2 dangerous choices, where to avoid one peril means inevitably confronting another. Once again, a poor woman has to suffer because of an unfaithful man. This time though, she wasn't saved by her lover. Even worse, she was damned to be a monster that even was denied the sweet release of death, and destined to spread fear among sailors. At the end of the story, we learn the saying caught between Scylla and Charybdis means to decide between 2 awful decisions. So I wonder now if this move was made for this saying as a form of teaching, or if a lot of sailors actually died around that place. At least the whirlpool that was supposed to be Charybdis is a real natural occurrence. Why Zeus was successful in his seductions, our next god is not that lucky. Apollo and Daphne. In the classical myths, magical transformations were often awarded as a recompense for virtue or imposed as a punishment for wickedness. However, for the nymph Daphne, daughter of Gaia, metamorphosis was neither reward nor penalty, but necessary protection. Once Cupid had a quarrel with Apollo. The child god was upset because Apollo told him he was too young for archery and should leave bows and arrows to men. In revenge, he shot Apollo with one of the arrows that caused its victims to fall in love with whomever the winged god chose. To perfect his vengeance, he selected Daphne. Daphne was a virgin nymph, in mourning for the prince Lyquie. He had fallen in love with her, and when she rejected him, he disguised himself as a woman, so that he could hunt with her. As companions in the chase, they became close, loving friends. Unfortunately, one day after Daphne and some other nymphs had been out hunting, the woman decided to bath. The nymph stripped naked, But Lyquie invented an excuse not to. Teasingly, the assembled nymphs tore off his clothes and his true sex was revealed. The virgin nymphs immediately assumed that Lyquie's intentions were dishonorable. Before Daphne could intervene, they killed him. After this, Daphne not only swore to remain a virgin, but also began to shun all human company, hunting alone. So Apollo had little hope for persuading her to return his intense passion. Nevertheless, the god was determined to have his way with her. Apollo used all his considerable charm to seduce Daphne. Then, in frustration, he attempted to rape her. She fled terrified into the forest, but Apollo gave chase and eventually cornered her. Despairing, she called to her mother for help. Gaia acted swiftly to protect her. Just as Apollo reached out to seize her, Daphne was transformed into a laurel tree. Apollo's lust was replaced by shame, and he humbly broke off a branch of the tree to wear in his hair. From that day on, the laurel was sacred to Apollo, and he awarded a crown made from its branches to the finest musicians and poets in honor of Daphne's beauty. Oh man, Cupid's arrows are really dangerous. I should look into them. Poor Apollo though. Manipulated by the arrows, he wasn't able to control himself. Also poor Daphne, of course, that didn't get the rest from all her sins and had to become a tree to protect herself. I don't know, there are a lot of tragic figures in this tale. I also feel bad for the prince, to be honest. I wonder though, if it hurt the tree when Apollo broke off a twig from her. Enough of lusty gods though. This one is a tragic myth about overestimating oneself. Helios and Phaeton. The Titans and their offspring played a role in establishing the natural order on Earth. Helios, the son of the Titan sun god Hyperion, and his partner Thea, drove the chariot of the sun across the sky. Phaeton was the son of Helios. His friends refused to believe that he was the son of a god, and even though his mother swore that it was true, the boy was not reassured. So his mother advised him to visit Helios and ask him directly. Phaeton traveled to Helios' magnificent palace to find out the truth. At first the boy could not approach his father because he was dazzled by the solar rays the god wore on his head. Putting the rays aside, Helios greeted the son with great affection and rashly promised to give the boy anything he wanted. Phaeton immediately asked to drive the chariot of the sun for one day. Although Helios tried desperately to dissuade him, Phaeton was insistent and Helios was bound by the promise he had made. He coated his son's face in an oil to protect his skin against the heat of the solar rays, and tried to teach him the correct way to drive the chariot, but Phaeton was too impatient to listen. The boy set out boldly, but as the horses rose into the sky, they sensed their driver's inexperience and bolted downwards. The terrified boy could not control the chariot, and the horses drew the vehicle ever lower, searing much of the earth with the sun's heat. The Nubian desert, once a fertile land, never recovered from this event, and the peoples of the south were so badly scorched that their skins turned black. Seeing that the earth risked total destruction, the gods blasted Phaeton, whose body crashed to earth in flames. To save other lands from devastation, the gods cooled the world with a drenching cloudburst. Losing your child to a promise you made with them must be a great pain to bear. This should have been a lesson for Phaeton to listen to his parent and not be high on overestimation. While he paid with his death, I hope that this tale became at least a lesson for other children. And maybe also become a lesson for you, my little pips. In the next story, a god ruins a whole family over one mistake. The Caledonian Boar Hunt. When the fearless hunter Meleager was a baby, the fates told his mother Althea that her son's life would last only as long as a log then burning in the fire was unconsumed. She snatched it up, doused the flames and hid it. Each year, Meleager's father Oeneus, king of Calydon, made a sacrifice to all the 12 Olympian gods, and his kingdom prospered with their favor. But one year he forgot to name Artemis. In revenge, the goddess sent a gigantic boar that ravaged the country, killing cattle and farmers. Onios sent out a call for help, promising the tusks and skin of the boar to whoever killed it. Many heroes assembled from all over Greece to hunt the beast under the leadership of Meleager. Some say Jason and Theseus were among them. There also came Atalanta, a girl who had been abandoned as a baby, suckled by a bear and raised by mountain hunters. She was a superb huntress and the fastest runner in the world. But Artemis was using Atalanta to ruin Onios. Meleager fell in love with her, and while the other hunters complained that the woman would bring them bad luck, he spoke up for her and showed her unfair favor. Out in the forest, Hylas and Rhecus, two centaurs that were part of the group, tried to rape Atalanta and were shot by her, while the hunter Ancaeus was castrated and disemboweled on the boar's tusks. Atalanta was the first to injure the boar, but it was Meleager who finally killed it. He presented its hide to Atalanta, but this act of generosity was too much for some of the other hunters. Toxeus and Plexippus, two of his mother's brothers, disputed Meleager's decision, and in a rage he killed them both. Meleager's mother watched the bodies of her brothers being carried back from the forest and cursed her son. She took the half-burned log from the chest in which she had hidden it and thrust it at once deep into the fire. Immediately Meleager died. His sisters shrieked as they mourned for him, and Artemis turned them into guinea fowl. Althea later hanged herself in remorse. RIP. What does this tale teach us? Never forget the Greek god in your sacrificial rituals. Otherwise, your life is ruined. This is not the only story, though, where Artemis is part of. Iphigenia's escape. Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, had offended Artemis, goddess of the hunt, by boasting of his peerless hunting skills. So she sent an ill wind to hamper the king's efforts to sail his fleet to Troy. According to the original version of the story, Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia to Artemis to secure favorable winds. But in the more uplifting version, Artemis appeared in person just as the young girl was stretched out beneath the sacrificial knife. The goddess snatched her away to safety, leaving a hind to be killed in her place. Artemis carried Iphigenia to the land of the Tauroi, who lived far away across the Black Sea in what is now the Crimea. There, the Greek princess became a priestess in the temple that contained a celebrated image of the goddess. It was custom of this barbarous land to sacrifice to Artemis all the strangers who visited the country, and for many years Iphigenia was forced to preside over these bloody rites. Then one day her own brother Orestes came to Taurian shores and was handed over to her in order to be killed. Recognizing one another, the long-separated pair suppressed their joy at the unexpected reunion, only long enough to effect their escape. They took the statue of Artemis with them, because they wished to find a more suitable home for it in Greece. Once back at home, Iphigenia became a priestess to Artemis again. The city of Troy was mentioned in the story, which was the setting of one of the probably most well-known Greek myths, the Trojan War. Let's read about the fates of some humans that were part of it. One of the most well-known human heroes was Achilles. What made him special, though? The childhood of Achilles. Forced by Zeus to marry a mortal, the sea nymph Thetis feared that her warrior son Achilles would bear her husband's taint. So she did all she could to shield him from danger, but destiny decreed that her efforts were to be in vain. Thetis cast her first 6 offspring into fire, hoping to burn out of them all that was not divine. None survived. But when the 7th baby was born, her husband Peleus stopped her and saved the infant's life. The boy grew up strong and handsome, and Thetis soon became reconciled to him, naming him Achilles. Yet, still fearing his human weakness, she made one more attempt to protect him, taking him to the Styx, the underworld river, whose waters conveyed immortality. She dipped him in. His whole body was submerged but for the heel by which she held him, and that small area was to remain fatally vulnerable. Under the tutelage of the wise centaur Chiron, the young man grew up unmatched in the arts of peace and war. So when news came that all the greatest warriors of Greece were gathered to attack Troy, Thetis at once feared that her son would be summoned. To protect him, she disguised him as a girl and sent him to the island of Skyros. The king's daughter, Deidamia, was only too happy to learn the truth of the imposture. In time she bore the newcomer a son. Yet, as Thetis had feared, envoys eventually tracked Achilles down. They had trouble recognizing him, for his real identity was well hidden. But then Odysseus, one of the leaders of the Greek army, employed a ruse. He sent a selection of gifts into the women's quarters that included, alongside jewelry and the other adornments, some armor and a sword. When one of the maidens was seen practicing swordplay, the envoys at once identified their target, Achilles. At their demand, he set off to the war, thereby realizing all his doting mother's worst fears. To modern eyes, Achilles seems a self-absorbed killing machine. The Trojan Hector now appears the more attractive figure, showing concern over the fate of his family and his country. Troy's tragic champion. Having exhausted all attempts at peacemaking, Hector resigned himself to seeing through a contest that he sensed could only lead to disaster. He led the Trojans bravely, driving the Greek invaders back to their ships and taking on Achilles' friend Patroclus, hand to hand. By killing Patroclus, he became the target of Achilles' murderous wrath. Eventually meeting at the Greek hero's hands, the death fated on him by the hatred of the goddess Athene, the deadly foe of Troy. Two scenes in the Iliad, the Greek poet Homer's account of the war, add a note of pathos to Hector's death. One is his leave-taking of his wife Andromache and their young son. When the warrior tries to kiss the boy farewell, the child shies back, terrified by his father's bronze helmet with its crest of horsehair bristles. Laughing, the proud father lifts it off to show his face and then clasps his son in a final embrace. The other is the hero's one recorded moment of weakness. When Achilles confronts him in the battle frenzy, the champion's nerve cracks and he flees from his adversary, who chases him round the walls of Troy. Then Hector finds fresh courage to confront his pursuer, going with dignity to the death he knows must follow. Such moments of fallibility, unknown to his mighty adversary, may not have enhanced his military reputation, but they give him a human dimension that his more single-minded opponent signally lacks. There was another tragic human in Troy, the beautiful Cassandra, daughter of the king, who, like her mother Hecuba and the other Trojans, Calchas and Laocoon, had the gift of prophecy. But for Cassandra, the gift was a curse, for she was doomed never to be believed. She was called the prophetess of doom. When Cassandra was visiting Apollo's sanctuary one day, the god himself was struck by her beauty. As a mark of favor, he promised her the gift of prophecy. But when in return he sought to have his way with her, the young princess rebuffed his advances. Apollo sought revenge. He could not take back his gift, for no divine edict could be undone. So instead, he added a cruel rider to his bequest, that no one should ever believe her predictions. From that time on, Cassandra could see only too clearly the tragedies that lay in store for her people. But whenever she sought to help them, by warning that their brother Paris, who eloped with Helene, would bring calamity on Troy, for example, or that the wooden horse was a Greek ruse. She was greeted only with incredulity. The people of the city believed she was mad. Her name lives on to this day as a generic title for all those unfortunate enough to be able to foresee imminent disaster without being able to avert it. After these short stories, I really want to know more about the Trojan War. Shall we have a little special reading only on it? Write me in the comments if you would like that, okay? We are leaving Troy now, and we look more into Thebes and the tragic tale of the king's daughter Antigone. Antigone's tragic defiance. The tragedy of Oedipus, king of Thebes, is one of the most memorable of all the classical myths, but less well known is the drama of his daughter, which was the subject of the play Antigone by the 5th century dramatist Sophocles. After Oedipus's death, his two sons quarreled over the succession to the throne. Eventually, they decided to rule in alternate years. Eteocles took the first turn, but when his time was up, he refused to hand over the kingdom to his brother as promised. Polynices raised an army to enforce his claim, sharing command with 6 allied leaders, the famous 7 against Thebes. But their forces were driven back from the city with huge losses. Both Oedipus' sons were killed in a duel. With their deaths, the throne reverted to their uncle Creon. Creon's first thought was to date their future rabbits, so he gave orders that while Eteocles should be interred in state as Thebes' former ruler, his brother Polynices should be left unburied. He decreed that those who disobeyed would die. Even so, one person was determined to defy the king's will. That night, Polynices' sister, Antigone, visited the battlefield and found her brother's body. She covered it with earth, giving him a proper burial. Caught in the act, the princess was taken to her uncle, who upbraided her. She refused to apologize, citing the demands of divine law in her defense. She refused to concede to the king even when he condemned her to death. The cruelty of the sentence shook Thebes, but Creon refused all appeals for mercy. Only when the old prophet Tiresias warned the king that the gods would punish him for the deed, did Creon finally consider clemency. But the change of heart came too late. Entering the stone room in which he had incarcerated her, Creon found that the princess had hanged herself with her veil. The tragedy did not end there. Creon's son Hermon, who was betrothed to Antigone, threw himself onto his sword upon discovering her fate, dying instantly. And when Creon's wife Eurydice learned of her son's suicide, she too stabbed herself fatally. One bad decision can lead once again to a whole new level of tragedy. Who is the prophet, though, that warned Creon of his future? Let's look into him more. Tiresias the prophet. Tiresias was a unique figure in classical mythology, credited with wisdom beyond that of any normal mortal and with knowledge of the future as well as of all aspects of the human condition. Gods and kings alike sought to benefit from his extraordinary sagacity. Tiresias was no ordinary mortal. He lived for 7 lifespans, in the course of which he spent time as a woman as well as a man. For his pains he was struck blind, but also acquired the power of prophecy. Tiresias' first transformation took place one day on Mount Kyllene in the Peloponnese, where he saw 2 snakes coupling. He struck them with his staff, killing the female. The act stirred the wrath of the goddess Hera, and instantly he found himself transformed into a woman. 7 years later, he saw another pair of snakes similarly occupied. This time he dispatched the male and was turned back into a man. Sometime later, Zeus and Hera were arguing over which partner gets the most pleasure from the sexual act. And to settle the dispute, they decided to consult the one person on Earth to have had experience of both conditions. Tiresias replied that, judged out of 10, the female gets 9 parts of the enjoyment, and the man only 1. An answer that so infuriated Hera that she struck him blind on the spot. In consolation, Zeus bestowed on him the gifts of long life and of prophecy. Tiresias became famous for his ability to foresee the future. He was consulted by Amphitryon and Alcmene, Heracles' parents, about the hero's conception, and he gave crucial advice to the rulers of Thebes during 2 successive sieges. According to the dramatist Sophocles, it was Tiresias who revealed to Oedipus, king of Thebes, that he had unwittingly killed his own father. Tiresias' powers even continued after his death, when he alone of the shades in Hades' underground realm was allowed to retain the gifts of speech and understanding, enabling him to continue his role as a prophet. In the Odyssey, Homer describes how Odysseus consulted Tiresias in the land of the dead to learn the outcome of his journey home. It seems like even after living as a woman, Tiresias didn't learn how to deal with one. At least not with one like Hera. You could even say he was in a Scylla and Charybdis situation here. At least Zeus was a bro here and gave him special powers, I guess. But why didn't he just give him back his eyesight? Maybe he was too afraid of his wife Hera? What would you choose? Being able to see the present or the future? In the last part, the famous Odysseus and his Odyssey was mentioned. In one of his adventures, he meets one really bad boy Cyclops, a humanoid monster with only one eye. What mother would bear creatures like this, though? A race of beastly shepherds. In the Theogony, an account of the origins of the gods, written by the Greek poet Hesiod in the 8th century, the first Cyclops were said to have been 3 sons of the sky god Uranus and the original Earth Mother Gaia. Fearing his own offspring, Uranus threw them down into the abyss of Tartarus. In revenge, Gaia persuaded another of her sons, Kronos, to castrate her husband. The 3 Cyclops were subsequently released by Zeus, whom they in turn helped to attain supreme power. Thereafter, a widespread tradition placed the Cyclops in Sicily. There, their best-known descendant, Polyphemus, was said to have fallen in love with the nymph Galatea, who did not return his affection. In one telling of the tale, Polyphemus crushed his rival Axis to death with a stone. This was the version followed in the opera Axis and Galatea by the 18th century composer George Friedrich Handel. Polyphemus played an even more familiar role in the adventures of Odysseus on his way back from the siege of Troy, as described in Homer's Odyssey. Cannibalistic in his appetites, he imprisoned the hero and his men in the cave, where he guarded his sheep, feeding on them one by one. To escape his clutches, Odysseus got the giant drunk and then put out his single eye with a red-hot stake. The Greeks then strapped themselves to the bellies of his sheep, escaping from the giant's lair when he drove the animals out to graze. Cyclops were also said to have built the walls of Mycenae and Tiryns, whose stone blocks were thought too large to have been laid by humans. The term Cyclopean is still used to describe massive stone structures. Maybe we should also make a video about the Odyssey, which is a classic, but it's always nice to read. Did you also know that Odysseus had a son? We are going to read about him now. Telemachus sets forth. Odysseus' son Telemachus was a baby when his father left for the Trojan War. He grew up into a fine young man, but he could not control the suitors who invaded his father's palace and pestered his mother Penelope to marry one of them. The goddess Athene arrived at the palace of Ithaca, disguised as a foreign king, and told Telemachus to send the suitors home. Then he must sail to Pylos and Sparta in search of news of his father. After she had finished speaking, Ephthine vanished through the roof, and Telemachus, realizing who she was greatly heartened. He summoned the suitors and berated them about their conduct, begging them to go away. Their leader, Antinous, retorted that they would not leave until Penelope agreed to marry one of them. Telemachus decided to set off secretly to Pylos. Ephthine went round the city to find the ship and recruit the crew. Then, assuming the form of Odysseus' old friend Mentor, she led Telemachus to the ship and joined him on board. Telemachus and Ephthine, in Mentor's disguise, soon reached Pylos, where they were received by King Nestor. He regaled them with tales of Odysseus' bravery, but knew nothing about his fate. Nestor gave Telemachus a chariot and his best horses, with a son as companion. Ephthine turned back while the young man drove on to Sparta. There Menelaus told Telemachus of his encounter with Proteus, the old man of the sea, who had reported seeing a tearful Odysseus trapped on an island with Calypso. The suitors back on Ithaca sent a ship to ambush Telemachus on his return journey and kill him, but Ephthine warned the prince and he came home by a different route to find his father, disguised as a beggar, already there. After all the tragedy and all the resentful gods, it's nice to actually read the story with a happy ending, where a god didn't curse a mortal and destroyed the whole family line. I have another story where a god rescues a human. Ariadne on Naxos. The intrepid Theseus ventured to Crete to do battle with the fearsome Minotaur in its lair beneath the palace of King Minos. Ariadne, the king's daughter, fell in love with Theseus and decided to help him overcome the monster. She acted under the illusion that the young hero would take her back to Athens and marry her there. But she was to be cruelly disappointed. On reaching the island of Dia, identified by most scholars with modern Naxos, there was some plum for the small island of Dia, just off Crete's north coast. Theseus abandoned her. While she slept on shore, he and his comrades sailed away, leaving her to a bitter awakening alone in a strange land. Luckily, the Olympians heard her complaints, and Dionysos himself came to rescue. The god of wine arrived on the island, accompanied by a festive train of satyrs and maenads. He informed the startled maiden that he had come to marry her forthwith, telling her, "Your wedding present is the sky itself." The two went back to Olympus, where over the years Ariadne was to bear her divine husband many children. In later times, her story would attract the attention of great artists. It's unbelievable how a hero like Theseus just abandoned this poor girl on an island. Obviously, he doesn't have to marry her, but at least bring her back to her father or to her home country? What the hell, Theseus? Really, what the fuck? At least she wasn't turned into a monster by a curse on that island, but instead into the wife of best boy Dionysos. Our next myth is probably my favorite one. It's about Orpheus and Eurydice. The attentive Pip might recognize the name Eurydice again from one of our earlier myths, but this one is a different one. Both die though. Little spoiler, hehe. Orpheus and Eurydice. Nowhere in world myth are the themes of love, death, and creativity interwoven as poignantly as in the story of the great poet and musician Orpheus, who made music so sweet that it could entrance wild beasts and even rocks and trees, and his beautiful young bride Eurydice. Orpheus and Eurydice had not been long married when Eurydice stepped on a snake, whose venom killed her. Distraught at the loss of the woman he loved, Orpheus determined to have her brought back to life. Carrying only his lyre, he went to the underworld to plead with its ruler, Hades, for Eurydice's release. He sang of love as a force that even Hades could not resist, and explained that he was determined not to leave the shades of the dead without his wife. When even the damned wept at his song, Hades agreed that Eurydice could return with Orpheus, on one condition, that he should not look at her until both had left the underworld. Orpheus guided his wife by striking notes on his lyre as they toiled up the dark path, but at the last moment, his longing to see Eurydice overcame him. He turned to embrace her, only to see her slip back into the shadows with a piteous cry. Overwhelmed by this second bereavement, Orpheus returned home and hardened his heart against women. This and his attachment to Apollo aroused the anger of the white Maenads, female followers of the rival god Dionysus. In one of their crazed orgies, they fell upon the poet and tore him limb from limb, then threw his head into the river Hebrus. The head floated, still singing, down to the sea, carried by currents to the island of Lesbos. It was finally laid to rest in the cave, where it served as an oracle for all who came to consult it. Oh man, this day always makes me creep. But let's end tonight's not on a sad note, okay? One last story about the young healer Melampus. The language of animals. One day a young healer called Melampus came to the court of King Protos of Tyrants. Melampus was a man of rare gifts who could understand the language of animals. When Phylacus asked Melampus to heal his son, Ephialus, he sacrificed 2 bulls to Apollo, and as 2 vultures swooped to feed off the remains, he overheard their conversation. They recalled how when Ephialus was still a boy, they had seen Phylacus castrating rams at this spot. The king came toward the boy with his bloody knife, and Ephialus took fright, thinking he, too, was to be castrated. Phylacus dug the knife into a nearby tree, while he comforted his son, but the fright had made the boy impotent. The vulture said that Ephialus could be cured if the knife was pulled out of the tree, and the ram spot was scraped off it, and given to Ephialus in a drink. Melampus did what they suggested, and cured Ephialus. Meanwhile Proetus had rabbits of his own. His 3 daughters had taken to roaming the mountainside, assaulting travelers. Melampus was able to find them and purify them. He married the one called Lyquie, and when Proetus died, inherited his kingdom. Melampus purifying the 3 gods and marrying one of them reminds me of the modern I can fix her mentality. Just that he was actually able to do it. What was your favorite story of tonight? Do you want to go more into depth of the Trojan War or the Odyssey? Please write me what you think about the video and if you want to have some extra videos, okay? Thank you very much for listening. Next week we will visit the last crater of civilization, ancient Mesopotamia, with its own crazy god stories. Sleep well, my little pip, and I hopefully see you next week. Good night.